Good morning. Good to see everybody here this morning. It sounds strange to say this, but we've actually got a pretty good crowd when you consider who all is home because they're sick. And it's good to see everybody else here. It seems like just about everybody else has made it this morning. And that's certainly a good thing for us this morning. We're going to talk about some things this morning. I'll say this morning about 40 more times. Right? But I want to think about some things with you today that are very practical and very important, and I think very necessary for us as a local congregation as we try to grow, as we try to do the work of the Lord here in this community. And it's going to be one of those sermons, you're reading my title right now, I'm getting some strange looks, I can tell. It's going to be one of those sermons where you may wonder, who's he talking to? I'm talking to you. If you're here this morning, if you can read the words on that slide, I'm talking to you. I want you to think about who you are to this local church. And I sincerely want each and every one of us to ask this question. What if every member of this local church was just like me? What would that mean for this church? What would that mean for our ability to come together like we are this morning and worship God and do so effectively? What would that mean about our ability to fund the work that we're doing here at this church? What would that mean about our ability to evangelize, to seek and to save the lost? What would that mean about the number of people that we consistently have here? If every member of this local church is just like me, what would that mean for this local church? You know, the Apostle Paul, when he's talking in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, he talks about all the difficulties that he's dealt with, all the suffering, the trials, so forth and so on that he's dealt with. And then after all of that, he says there's something else, right? There's something else that he deals with. There's something else that concerns him. He says, my deep concern for all the churches. I know that's the Apostle Paul, and I know that the majority of the congregations he's thinking about, he probably had a hand in establishing, probably had personal relationships with many of the Christians that were there, but I don't think there's anything in what Paul says here that should apply for you and me, at the very least, when we think about the local church of which we're members. What is our concern for this church? Do we have the kind of deep and abiding love for the church that would lead us to think and to be like Paul? Let me ask you this way. Can we love the Lord and not love His church? Is it possible for us to be the Christians that we ought to be if we don't have any real concern for the local church of which we are a part? Can I be in submission to Jesus and not work in submission or work in support of His church? You know, we're the body of Christ, and we manifest that belonging as we gather here as a local church. Can I truly claim to be in submission to Jesus? If I'm not concerned for the work going on in the local church, if I'm not supporting that work in whatever way that I possibly can I serve Jesus? Can I serve Jesus and yet not serve as a faithful, committed member of the local church? I think these are serious questions we all need to ask ourselves. You know, it's kind of the beginning of the year, kind of that time of year where we kind of sit back and we say, how can I do better this year? Maybe these are the kinds of things that we need to be thinking about and we need to be considering in our lives today. Am I what I ought to be before the Lord? And one of the ways that I can answer that question is by looking to see who I am in regards to this local church of which I am a part. So I'm going to get real practical. I'm going to get all into business today, and we're going to talk about these things. But understand, I'm not just talking to you, I'm talking to myself as well. Let me ask you something. If every member of this local church was just like you, just as committed to you, love the church just like you do, just as willing to serve as you are, would we ever get anything done? Would the local church be able to get the things done that the local church needs to be able to do? And you know, this is an important question because there's just a lot to do in any local church, and this one included. There's offices to be filled, right? There's roles to be filled. There's elders, there's deacons, there's teachers. And you may be sitting there right now going, but we've got elders and we've got deacons and we've got teachers. And let me tell you something, that's just not how it works. When we're talking about these offices to be filled, if we look at, we say, well, we've got them now, we're okay. It won't be long before we don't have them. I mean, we've seen ourselves over the past 2 or 3 years how quickly we can go from having more than enough teachers to where we're at right now, where we have just enough teachers. And if we're not developing new teachers, if we're not finding more people in our local church that are willing to step up, how long will it be before we don't have enough teachers? We've got several good deacons, and I tell you right now, they're all hardworking men too. And the thought that we couldn't use more men to help them out just misunderstands what the work of the deacon is and what all there is to be done here at this local church. We've only got 2 elders. And that's a dangerous position for any church to be in, because if something were to happen to one of the elders, we don't have an eldership. And there could be any number of things that can happen. Any number of things can happen, and we wouldn't have an eldership. So if you're sitting contentedly thinking, well, we've got everything that we need, there's no real need for me to grow or to work into this role, friend, I want you to understand you misunderstand the role. And you misunderstand the reality of a local church. We need song leaders. We need men who will lead prayers. We need men who will serve the Lord's Supper, who will do the scripture reading, who will make the announcements, who will do the practical things that are part of every assembly that we have here. I've said this before. I want to say it again. As things have gotten a little difficult over the past 2 or 3 years, and I think we're just going to be in a reality for a while where we may be missing entire families for quite some time. It has been encouraging to me to hear men walk in the building and walk up to Aaron or to Clinton or just go in the office and look at the list and hear them say, what do you need me to do? Because you know right now, on an average Sunday morning when we walk in here, there's a really good chance that we're going to have a few holes to fill. That's just the world we're living in right now. There's that chance. And to hear those men walk in and be aware of that and be responsible and be considerate enough to be proactive and go up to the men that are in charge of kind of organizing the service and say, what can I do? Man, that is so encouraging. And men, if you've done that, I don't know if you know how encouraging that is for me to hear, and I think for others to hear as well. Can I add something to that? It's like the same 4 men every time. It's like the same 4 men every time. And so let me ask you this question again. If everyone here was just like you, would we have had the men we needed to wait the table this morning? Would we have had a song leader? Would we have men to say the prayers? And I know what you're thinking. Somebody would have done it. Well, let me inform you about something. There is no brother somebody. He doesn't worship here. And the more we develop that attitude that somebody will do it, the more likely we are to have a situation where, I wouldn't say nobody would do it, but where 1 or 2 men are being asked to do just about everything, while other capable men are sitting in the pew doing, as far as our public worship, nothing. Brother, that's not good. That's not good for the local church as a whole. That does not set a good example for our young people here in this congregation. That does not encourage those who are willing to work. And that is a situation in which men are not growing as they ought to grow. And let me tell you something. I know this for a fact. Our deacons that organize our worship service do not like coming up to you and asking you if you can fill in. They don't like it. They don't like feeling like they're having to pressure somebody to do something they might not want to do. They don't like the fact that they have to go to essentially the same 5 or 6 people week in and week out. Can you lead a prayer? They don't like that. They don't want to be in that position. It's the reality of where we are right now, right? Again, we never know who's going to be sick when. We never know exactly who's going to be here on a given Sunday. John makes out the duty list and has no idea if the men are going to be able to be here when he's assigned them. Men, why don't we take it upon ourselves when we walk in this building to go up and ask, what can I do to help today? And maybe you're sitting there right now, and maybe you don't participate in the public service. Let me ask you, what can you start doing? What can you start doing? Well, I really don't do well speaking in front of the congregation. I get that. I understand that. There's 4 spots at that table every Sunday morning. Only 2 of them ever say a word. I mean, standing on the end and passing out a tray is not asking very much. But letting those who organize these things know, hey, if you need me, I will. Coming up to them and saying, hey, what can I do today? Not putting them in that awkward position. By the way, I hadn't talked about getting here on time in a long time, so I'm going to do it right now. If you can't get here on time, you can't help. I mean, we usually try to have those things assigned before we start, right? And so having the kind of responsibility that says, you know what, I'm going to get there early enough that if I need to help, I can. Boy, that would mean a lot to the local church here. It would be so helpful to the local church here. Somebody says, well, I don't feel comfortable doing any of those things. Man, I'd love to have more people willing to help with that sound booth back there. I'll know I had to do it last week, and that didn't go very well at all. Man, having more people that are willing. I don't know how to do it. We'll show you. We'll show you. And then there's simple things like greeting visitors. Like you know, we really want our visitors when they come in here to feel welcome. I think we do a pretty good job of that. But are you taking that upon yourself? Are you taking that responsibility upon yourself? And by the way, I'm not just up here harping about things I wish I saw more of. This is what Romans 12 says we ought to be doing, right? For just as we have many members in one body, Romans 12 verse 4, and all the members do not have the same function, so we who are many are one body in Christ and individually members of one another. Since we have gifts that differ according to the grace given us, each of us is to exercise them accordingly. I want you to get that part there in verse 6. Each of us is to exercise them accordingly. There's no room for just sitting in a pew in Romans chapter 12. Now, what the apostle says is what you're capable of doing, you need to be busy doing. Verse 7. If service in his serving, or he who teaches in his teaching, or he who exhorts in his exhortation, he who gives with liberality, he who leads with diligence, he who shows mercy with cheerfulness. And brethren, if this is the mindset that we have, what I can do, I will do. And I might add to that, I'm going to continue adding to what I can do, right? I'm going to continue growing in what I'm capable of. Then what I'm going to be doing is looking for opportunities to serve rather than sitting and waiting on someone to come ask me to serve. And I've spent a lot of time talking about the public worship service this morning because that's where we have an obvious issue right now. But this goes as well for those things that we do behind the scenes. This goes as well for all the work that goes to putting together Bible classes, whatever it might be. If everybody else was just like me, what would all that look like? Could anyone be counted on to get anything done? I think this goes hand in hand with the concept of attendance. You know, turn over to Hebrews chapter 10 with me. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 24. And I want to think about what we're here to do. And while we're turning over there, you know, I want to point something out. We had a short period of time a couple of years ago where we weren't able to come up here and assemble in the building for a little while. And I think maybe that little period of time has caused some of us to think differently about the assembly, maybe led some of us to think differently about attendance. I found it a little bit hard to talk about attendance the way I had in the past because of our situation, and we never know who's going to be sick and who's not, and so forth and so on. But I think we're far enough from that it needs to be the past. And I think we're far enough from that it's time for us to start thinking about our responsibilities. You know, I have a responsibility as a Christian and as a member of the local church to worship with that church when that church worships. Let me rephrase that. To assemble with that church when that church assembles. When the doors here are open and the opportunity is presented, I have a responsibility to do my best to be there. And there's a reason for that. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 24. Here's what we're here to do. Let us consider how to stimulate one another to love and good deeds, not forsaking our own assembling together as the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. Well, I tell you what, the live stream, the camera, all that, it sure was a blessing, I think, when we were in that very difficult period. And I think it's been a blessing since then, when entire families have had to be out for multiple weeks because of illness. You're not completely cut off. You have an opportunity to engage with the study and what's going on in the local church. And I think that's a wonderful and a beautiful thing. But I want to agree with Chris, some things he said the past couple of times he's been up here. I think maybe for some, we've gotten where that's a little too useful. Maybe for some, we've gotten to the point where we're a little too comfortable staying home. Because after all, I can still hear the sermon and we'll still hear the songs, and maybe we sing in our home or whatever it is. And I want you to think about that with me for just a moment. You know, if there's nothing that can be done about it, there's nothing that can be done about it. If you're sick, I hope you'll stay home. I really do. And I'm glad that you've got that opportunity to be engaged, at least in some way, with what the local church is doing here this morning, if you are sick and at home, and if you are watching this via the live stream. But let's be real clear. If I'm staying at home just because I've gotten a little more comfortable, after all, I can still be in my pajamas and on the couch, maybe drinking a cup of coffee right now if I'm at home, and nobody's going to know. And I can still hear the sermon, I still hear the Bible class, whatever it may be. And maybe I've gotten a little more comfortable with that. I want you to understand something. You've forgotten what it is to come here. You've forgotten a big part of why we come together and assemble. It's not just to hear information. You're right, I can hear that information anywhere, anytime, in a multiplicity of ways. That's not the only reason we're here. A big part of why we're here is to encourage one another. A big part of why we are here is to lift one another up. A big part of why we are here is to provide some sort of accountability to one another. And friends, you don't get that if you're not here, if you're not a part of it. Somebody says, I heard the sermon. As a matter of fact, I can pay attention better at home than I can in the auditorium. Well, good for you. Maybe that's true. But you're not getting what the people here are getting. You know, that was an interesting thing to me when we did go through that period where we weren't coming up here to the building as normal. And then we came back. And a lot of people, a lot of members of this church said, you know what? I didn't realize how much I'd miss it. I didn't realize how much I didn't realize how important this is to me. And maybe you're sitting there and you're like, well, I don't quite get that. Plug in. Plug in. Be more consistent in your attendance. Be more involved when you get here. Be a part of the encouragement and the uplifting. Be a part of the accountability. Somebody says, well, what are you talking about accountability? Brother, I don't know how you sit in these pews and hear other people sing about their faith and pray about their faith and celebrate their faith the way that we do Sunday morning, Sunday night, and Wednesday night, and not think about your own faith. I don't know how to sit here with you and commemorate the death of my Lord and hear the prayers and realize, you know, there's however many people are here this morning and they're focusing on the same thing and they came here for the same purpose, and be reminded of how important that is. I love it in Bible class when someone, you know, is making a comment and it's not me and it's not Chris and maybe it's not, you know, not the Bible class teacher. Somebody's making a comment and they're talking about the need for morality and they're talking about the need for worship. And you know what that is? That's accountability. That's you and me, every one of us, being reminded and hearing it and being encouraged, and maybe if I need it, being rebuked a little bit to be a better Christian. If every member of this local church was just like you, who would be here to do that? You know, we have the example of the early disciples. They continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine and fellowship and in the breaking of bread and in prayers, Acts chapter 2 and verse 42. And they were getting together every day, by the way. They were getting together every day. We come up here 2 days a week on an average week. 2 days a week. If everyone was just like you, who could be depended on to be here at every service? You know, David said in Psalm 122, I was glad when they said to me, let us go to the house of the Lord. And maybe this is part of the issue. Maybe we haven't learned to love what happens here. Maybe we haven't developed that need for what happens in the local worship. And friend, I want to tell you that's something you need to work on. If you're sitting here right now and you're thinking, well, I'd be here more, but it just doesn't do it for me, I just don't enjoy it, I want you to rethink the whole concept. Stop thinking about what you get and start thinking about what you give. Stop thinking about what you take and start thinking about what you offer. Plug in and be active. And be present. Remember, by being here, you encourage others. You know, the same thing is true about your absence. And let me make a point about that. I tell you, just from a preacher's perspective, getting up on a Sunday morning and looking out, we've had a few of these Sunday mornings here lately, and you just kind of look out and you're like, wow, we got a full house today. We got a crowd today. That is one of those small things that is so encouraging, it's hard to put it into words. It's so encouraging, it's just hard to put it into words. How exciting it is to see a room full of people that came here to worship God. I'll tell you something else that's encouraging to me. We've got a handful, I'm going to be very careful how I say this, but we have a handful of members who are very, very experienced. I'll say that. And if those doors are unlocked, matter of fact, some of them unlock them. But if those doors are open, they're coming in here. They're going to be here. As a matter of fact, I see them come in sometimes in certain weather, certain conditions, and I think, oh, I wish they could have stayed home today. They didn't. They came here. And they're glad to be here. If you're struggling with your attendance, and maybe you've got kind of that mindset right now where I don't see the value, call one of them up, because you know exactly who I'm talking about. I don't have to name a name. Call one of them up and ask them what they get and why they're here so regularly. And let them share their love for worshiping God with you. And see if that doesn't change your mind. See if that doesn't open you up. They'll talk to you. I'll volunteer them right now. Take advantage of that. We've already talked about the need to serve while we're here. We definitely need that. We also ought to think about what our visitors see. You know, visitors walk into a half-empty church building, they got to wonder what's going on with that congregation, don't they? We're talking about visitors from our community. Maybe it's other Christians moving into town. Whatever the case may be, what do we want them to see? What would you want to see if you were in their shoes? You would want to see a full building, right? You would want to see a lively group of people. You would want to see a group of people that clearly want to be there. And they're demonstrating that, first of all, by being there. And when you see that, you're encouraged by what you experience. You have this desire. You want to be with them, so forth and so on. If every member of this local church was just like you, who could be depended on to be here at every service? If every member was just like you, would we have the means necessary to carry out our work? And I'm talking about financially. Proverbs chapter 3 and verse 9 says, honor the Lord from your wealth and from the first of all of your produce. And you know, you go back and you read the Old Testament, this was a big deal for the Israelites, wasn't it? They tithed, they gave the first of their crops, they gave the first of their flocks. It was a very, very big deal to them to make sure that the temple had what it needed to be cared for, that the priests had what they needed to be cared for. And so they gave honor to God with their possessions, and that's the idea that we're really talking about. Romans chapter 8, we already saw this. Romans chapter 12 and verse 8, we already saw this. If I can give, I should give with liberality. And to be honest, for most of us, we're living in a time where we're wealthy enough that we have more than we need. We have more than we need, and we're able to give to the work of the church. 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verses 1 and 2, we find out that we're to give as we prosper on the first day of the week. Do we do that? Do we give as we prosper? Yeah, I know some brethren, I've talked to some brethren, and they've told me they give based on what they think the church needs. That's not what 1 Corinthians 16 says. The work of the church is expansive. The work of the church continues to grow as the church has capability of doing the work. An eldership can't sit down and plan to do certain works if they're not aware that they're going to have the means to carry that work out. I'm talking about different avenues of spreading the gospel, supporting other preachers, whatever it may be. The leadership, the eldership has to know the funds are there in order to plan the work and begin the work. And so if we're looking around saying, well, I think we do this and we only need that to accomplish it, it's the wrong way to think. No, we're to give as we prosper. 2 Corinthians chapter 9, and there in verse 7, we're to give cheerfully. The Apostle Paul there is encouraging the church at Corinth to join in liberally with the contribution that he's taking to the saints there at Jerusalem. And there's some issues between those people, and it would have been an easy thing for those Corinthian Christians to give a little bit grudgingly, and Paul says, no, we're not going to do that. No, let's give cheerfully. Let's give because we want to do this. Let's give because we care about the work that is being done. Does this describe me in my giving? It's a very personal question, isn't it? And I don't know that I can give you real clear guidelines where you can just kind of sit down and do a math problem and figure out if you're giving like you ought to give. I don't know that that's possible. I do think there are some things we might look at, like, do I spend more on cable than I give to the work of the church? Well, if I do, I got a problem. I got a problem. If this was not my best month financially, is the first thing that goes what I'm going to contribute to the church, and I still get to eat out 3 or 4 times that month? Well, if that's the way I'm thinking, I've got a problem, don't I? I've got a problem. Do you kind of sit down at the beginning of the year or maybe whenever review time is for you at your work, and you kind of sit down and reevaluate? Am I doing what I can do? Am I doing what I should do? If I don't think that way, if I never have that conversation with myself, am I doing what I ought to be doing? Am I carrying those things out? Somebody says, Sean, why are you up here talking about money? Because it's just reality. The work of the local church requires money. There are things that we need to be doing that require money. The church of Philippi was able to help the Apostle Paul in the book of Philippians. We find that out. They were able to give to him more than once for his needs. Why? Because despite their poverty, they're one of those Macedonian churches talked about in 2 Corinthians chapter 8. Despite their poverty, they were giving with liberality, and so the work of the Lord's church was being done. Again, those suffering Christians in Judea, in Jerusalem, how did they get aid? Because the churches there and their members throughout the world were giving liberally so that they could do this work. The work the church has to do requires money. We might not like to think about that, but that's the reality. Church has bills. I don't know about y'all, but I love when that air conditioner kicks on in the summertime when I'm up here, get that nice cool breeze. And I know y'all do too, because if it doesn't run, we all know what happens. Well, got to pay the power bill, right? We've got to take care of these things. There are bills and necessities which require money. It's amazing what class material costs. You're lucky if you can find a workbook that costs $7 or $8. Think about all the classes we have back there. Think about just passing those out in the auditorium. Do we want those things? Do we want those tools that help us in our study? It seems that we do. Well, it takes money. It takes money. I'm not going to talk about the preacher. But what if everyone gave like you? Would we be able to do the work we need to do? Very personal question, I know. but certainly one worth asking ourselves. If every member of this local church was just like you, who would hear the gospel? The work of evangelism is such an important work that we need to be involved in. Jesus tells His apostles in Matthew chapter 28, and there in verses 19 to 20, "Go therefore and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit." Go out and teach them, He says, to observe all that I commanded you, and lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. I think that's a commandment given to His apostles, but certainly one that we need to follow in their footsteps, right? Sharing the gospel is an inherent part of being a member of a local church. Even in Acts chapter 8, when the Christians in Judea had been scattered, or in Jerusalem had been scattered out, what did they do? They went everywhere preaching. Preaching. That's not just the apostles in Acts chapter 8. That's every member of the church going out and teaching the gospel. Why? Well, because they understood that the people they were encountering were lost. Paul talks in Romans chapter 1 about his duty to go and to preach to the Gentile. It's a very, very interesting passage. Turn over there with me if you will. Romans chapter 1, and there in verse 14, he says, "I'm under obligation, both to Greeks and to barbarians." That's Gentiles. Here's a Jewish Pharisee who's converted to Christ. And he says, I have an obligation, I have a duty to go and share the gospel with Gentiles. Verse 15, "So for my part, I am eager to preach the gospel to you also who are in Rome, for I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God to salvation to everyone who believes, for the Jews and the Greeks." Why does he say that? Why does he say I have an obligation, a duty to go and preach the gospel? Why did Paul have an obligation to go to people that probably would not have liked him, who would have looked down upon him? Why would he have an obligation or a duty to go do that? Because it had happened to him. Because he had experienced the grace of Jesus Christ. Because his sins had been forgiven. And because of that, he had an obligation to his Savior to spread that gospel. I want you to think about that. Your obligation to evangelize, to share the gospel with your friends and neighbors, is not about the numbers of people we have worshiping in this congregation. If that's why we're spreading the gospel, we're doing it all wrong. It's about my recognition of what God has done for me and me demonstrating my love for Him and appreciation by sharing that gospel with my fellow man. It's about me looking around, not critically, not judgmentally, not with condemnation in my heart, but looking around with mercy and love and pity in my heart and realizing that the majority of the people I encounter every day have not accessed that grace because they've not obeyed that gospel. And having a desire, an overwhelming desire for them to learn what the gospel would share with them and experience what can be theirs only through the gospel. If every member of this local church evangelized like you do, how would those in Amarillo, Texas hear the gospel? By the way, we have a tremendous opportunity. I think we're living in a time, and I think over the next several years, this opportunity is just going to grow. Because so many people today have left churches. And it started with the pandemic, it started with the shutdown, and a lot of people stayed home, and kind of what we already talked about, and they found out, hey, I can do this from my couch. And whereas, brethren, congregations like this, we're talking about 1-2% of our congregation, if that. Have you seen what's going on with the denominations? I mean, they're losing their membership. They're down 50-60% in their attendance. People, and I've talked to people that they find out I'm a preacher and they want to tell me, man, I sure like those live streams. We do church at home every Sunday. You know what that's going to produce. So there's a reason there are people in those churches to start with. And that's because there was something missing in their life and they thought they could find it there. And let me tell you something, that live stream is not going to fill it. And it's still going to be missing. And we have an opportunity before us. And I really think over the next 3 to 5 years, as the aftermath of that great exodus kind of grows in people's hearts, boy, that opportunity is just going to grow bigger and bigger. Because rather than having to fight with what a denomination teaches, what we're going to be able to do is talk to people about what the church will give them, what the church provides. Not in some monetary or physical sense, but all the spiritual blessings that are ours because we're part of the local church, because we're part of the body of Christ. And brethren, I think people more and more over the next few years are going to realize, well, I left the church and I left something behind. Are we going to be busy reaching out to them? Are we going to be busy now building the relationships that we need so that when they have that realization, we can talk to them about what the Lord will do for them and about what it will be like for them to experience the grace of God and the spiritual blessings that are theirs in the church? Are we going to be building those relationships now? If every member of the local church here evangelizes just like you, who would hear the gospel? Would we all strive for unity? We talked about this Wednesday night in our Bible class. That need for us to agree, to be of one mind, to be of the same judgment. And of course, what we notice is you do that by setting your ego and your pride aside. And rather than coming into the situation saying, how can I get my way? You come into the situation saying, how can I serve my brother? And if I have that mindset, then there's unity in the local church. Just to be honest, there's some people that don't really like peace, aren't there? There are some people that just don't like unity. Who are you? If everybody thought about that the way that you think about that, would we have unity in the local church? There's no doubt we ought to. That's exactly what Jesus prayed for in John 17. There in verse 20, I do not ask on behalf of these alone, talking about the apostles, but for those also who believe in me through their word, that they may all be one, even as you, Father, are in me, and I in you, that they also may be in us, so that the world may believe that you sent me. You know, there are people who cause problems because of their attitude, because they've got an agenda, because of what they're teaching, because they really, really are interested in things being done their way. Whatever it may be, they come in and they cause problems, and we see that issue. You know, Paul writes about it a lot, doesn't he? That's the problem in Corinth. He's got that problem. He addresses it in Romans chapter 16. There's somebody's come in those Galatian churches and convinced them not to accept the gospel as it had been presented to them. Is that who I am? Because if it is, I need to change. What if every member was just like me? Would we be at peace? Would we be at peace? If every member were just like you, would we have trouble finding someone to get the work done? What would our attendance be like? Would our worship be encouraging and uplifting to those who are present? Would we have what we need to do the work that needs to be done both in our local church and in our community? Would we succeed in our evangelistic efforts? Will we have peace and unity? The answer to all this can be yes. Should be yes. Maybe it is yes. But you know, as I'm looking at this list of things and I'm thinking about myself, what an opportunity for introspection. To sit back and ask, how can I serve the Lord more faithfully today than I did yesterday? How can I be of benefit to the local church more today than I was yesterday? I tell you this, no matter how good you're doing, there's room for growth. You can do more. We'd love to encourage you to do that. We'd love to encourage you in your walk with Christ, in your growth in His grace and in His knowledge. That's what we're here to do, isn't it, as we worship God together. Maybe you're here this morning and your problem is more than an attitude. Maybe your problem has to do with sin. Well, we'd love to help you with that as well. If you need to obey the gospel, we would welcome you. We would help you. If you need to repent of sins, having already obeyed the gospel, we would love to embrace you and help you in any way that we can. If you need our help this morning, why don't you let us know right now while we stand and while we sing.